Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I'm Emily McCreary Ruiz Esparza. I'm an independent journalist who writes about work, the labor market, and women in the workplace. I've written for outlets including The Economist, the BBC, Washington Post, Fast Company, and Digiday, lots of different places. This webinar today is brought to you by Attuned, the AI-driven platform that measures intrinsic motivation and psychological safety. Attune shows companies what really matters to their employees by making visible the psychological data that exists around and between people. This allows busy managers to get to know their teams quicker and communicate more effectively, which in turn reduces employee turnover, drives engagement, productivity, and innovation, increases psychological safety, and ultimately builds happier, more successful organization. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing how employers can build psychological safety in diverse workplaces. A psychologically safe workplace can strengthen social networks, boost innovation, increase retention. And without that sense of security, engagement and productivity suffers, innovation slows to a crawl, attrition can increase, and especially among those who belong to traditionally marginalized groups. But how does psychological safety grow and spread? Is it something that can be measured and therefore improved? And what are DEI leaders doing today to build psychologically safe teams? In this webinar, we will explore how our identities, both conspicuous and concealable, affect the way we relate to our colleagues and travel through our careers. We'll also examine the real effects of psychological safety on factors like productivity, engagement, individual career growth, innovation, workplace relationships, social networks, mental health. We'll address a lot of things. Today, I'm joined by Isaac Sabat, Associate Professor of Industrial and Organizational Psychology at the University of Houston in the United States, and Natasha Ferguson, Chief Operating Officer at the Taylor Bennett Foundation, who's joining us from the UK. Just as a reminder to our audience, we'll take questions from you all throughout the conversation. So you can put questions or comments in the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And last but not least, do be sure to check out Attune's new guide to psychological safety. The report is actually launching next week, but everyone here will get an early access download link along with this recording. So look out for that in your inbox within the next day or so. That paper outlines 6 risky behavior categories that allow you to accurately measure the psychological safety of your team. Those are knowledge sharing, reporting mistakes, authentic self-expression, making decisions, disagreeing, and feedback. Attune Psychological Safety Assessment helps companies measure each one of these in turn to identify which areas need to be focused on to improve overall psychological safety of your team. Now, with all that said, let's meet our panelists. I'd like for both of you to introduce yourselves and describe the work that you do at the organizations where you work. We'll start with Natasha Ferguson. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much for having me, Emily, and hello to everybody joining us today. So my name is Natasha Ferguson, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at the Taylor Bennett Foundation. We are an award-winning UK charity that exists to increase ethnic representation within the public relations and communications profession. So in my role, I work alongside our CEO in terms of implementing our strategy and ensuring that when it comes to day-to-day operations for our candidates and our employers, we are optimized in delivering the best service to support meeting the challenges we have in the profession today.
Thanks, Natasha. Welcome. Isaac.
Hello, I'm Isaac Sabat. I'm an associate professor of IO psychology at the University of Houston. I do research on all aspects of workplace diversity and discrimination. And as I'll talk about, there's a lot of overlap between diversity and inclusion and psychological safety. Specifically, I do research on identifying barriers faced by each marginalized group, and then I look at strategies that organizations and individual employees can engage in to remediate those different barriers.
Glad to have you both. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's lay a little bit of groundwork. Isaac, I'm going to come to you first. Could you describe for us what happens to health and well-being when we feel psychologically safe at work, and what happens when we don't feel safe?
Sure. So, psychological safety typically refers to environments where individuals feel that they can just feel comfortable sharing ideas, their concerns, or even mistakes without fearing embarrassment or punishment. We know from the literature that when people feel more psychologically safe, they feel more valued and at ease. Um, and they also feel less stressed than when they don't feel safe. Naturally, this leads people to experience more positive workplace health outcomes and improved well-being. Um, Also because of this reduced tension and stress, when we're in psychologically safe environments, we feel more comfortable taking risk and contributing to the overall team, and just being a part of that collaboration. It can, make us uh, experience more resilience and personal growth as well, and more positive job attitudes like increased job satisfaction and commitment as well. When we don't feel safe, we, of course, feel a greater sense of anxiety, stress, and burnout. We often exhibit more what we call withdrawal behaviors. So things like absenteeism and uh, more turnover intentions, where we're more likely to want to leave the company when we don't feel safe within that environment. Um, yeah, overall, it just contributes to the sense of loneliness and isolation. And obviously, all of these things are linked to our personal health and overall well-being.
Isaac, do you find in your research that that is experienced on an individual level, as in, can one person on a team feel that way, or does that tend to happen at the team level? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, there can be direct effects or reasons why an individual might experience uh, low levels of psychological safety, right? And it could be because they um, feel like they aren't valued within the organization, that their contributions don't matter. They could feel like there's a stifling environment. And that can have detrimental impacts on them as an individual, but it also can have widespread impacts on the team. So we look at this within the diversity literature. If somebody's experiencing discrimination, there's a host of negative outcomes associated with that, but also it has negative effects for the people around that person as well. Um, we often look at how witnessing discrimination and incivility can negatively impact those around us. And people in general want to be in an environment where certain individuals aren't being attacked, or certain individuals don't, where feel unsafe at work. It can have sort of a cyclical effect on the people around them as well.
Natasha, it looked like you were nodding in agreement there. In your work, what kind of ripple effects do you see when psychological safety doesn't exist in a workplace, and when it does?
So to everything that Isaac said, people leave. It's a really short answer. Um, they come to us to lament, and we, in our pastoral care, provide strategic counsel and advice on how to create an exit strategy that maintains their mental health, which, pending the severity of what they may be experiencing, also determines how they're able to think clearly and concisely to the decisions they need to make to come out of that situation. And then you also find that you get a group that believe in in how they're being treated. Maybe it's not as bad. I've got a job. Um, it's not as bad as somebody else in a different department who may be dealing with something. I'm just going to stay. Because what we have to remember at the core of everything, it's all about the relationships we build, right? And you spend a lot of time with your managers, and it's that fight or flight kind of thing. And for some people, they try to And I would say this is a very small third group that we find. Some try to fight by, and it's not even fight, I think we want to change the word. They try to address the concerns by using the company channels via HR, etc., to report and bring justice. For diverse employees, where they are a minority, if an organization is pending their maturity in their D&I program, their strategic vision, how leaders deal and kind of look at D&I, it could go one of two ways. It can be they could use that channel and it could be a benefit to addressing and delivering accountability to resolve the issues that they're dealing with. Or it could be they go through those channels and find that because there is bias, there what needs to be dealt with isn't being dealt with the way it should be, which then brings them back down to a decision of, do I stay or do I go? So I think what Isaac has brilliantly shared, the ripple effects, especially for diverse employees, while there's not many, the impact on the different avenues that they can take are very grave.
You brought up managers and the relationships within the workplace, how closely are or how significantly a manager relationship affects our experience. Tell us about
Mm-hmm.
the role of managers in fostering a psychologically safe workplace. What are the characteristics of someone who really succeeds, who really struggles, or even fails?
Do you know what? Ooh, Emily, I think it's balance. Really, it's balance. It's when you understand what your role consists of as a leader, you will also understand that in your remit, there are going to be times when you need to take an authoritative approach, where in relation to business development, for example, you're liaising with external clients. So there's an authoritative leadership approach that you take that requires you to deliver an end goal. But I think for the employees that a manager deals with on day to day, there are some other leadership styles that I think for diverse employees, they tend to find it's not completely varied. So, what I mean by that is, I believe that you can be authoritative, but I think it's also important, as McKinsey kind of reported in their, I think it was their 2021 report around psychological safety and when it comes to leadership. And they kind of highlighted there's four key elements that all leaders should kind of carry in their traits, which was authoritative leadership, consultative leadership, I sometimes get tongue tied, so apologies. Then there is, I believe it's consultative, it is challenging, and it's also supportive. So what that means is, as a leader, you are required to have a level of discernment to understand how to deal with employees in whatever dynamic or situation they're in, and what style of leadership is going to be required to deliver an end goal that is not only going to bring further trust, respect, and understanding to you and the employee, but also ensures that the employee can be reassured that in the situation that's being addressed, in me having to change the leadership style that's required to meet the end goal, then I think for me, when it comes to managers, having a very balanced and fair approach to the different styles of leadership that supports the success of teams is essential. And I think it's critical because we spend a lot of time with each other. So the ability to understand how that works and why it's important, not just for you as a leader, but for the employee and for business is imperative. And I think for us here in the UK, that is one of our biggest struggles, especially within our profession.
I'd like to keep talking about leadership and getting a sense of what your workplace is like. If you are a business leader, how do you actually know if the workplace that you're running is a psychologically safe one? For instance, some people will behave very differently around those in power, or simply just tell them what they want to hear. Are you guys happy here? Oh yeah, this is great. I really don't want to lose my job or threaten your authority, so this is fine. How do you get an honest assessment of what your workplace is like to exist in? Isaac, let's start with you.
Sure, yeah. One of the things I always advocate for is doing anonymous feedback surveys, and doing this proactively before there are issues. Um, if for organizations that genuinely care about maintaining psychologically safe environments, they should also make sure that there is no retribution for these responses, and also that they take this feedback seriously and actually do something with this information. Um, Otherwise employees aren't going to continue to provide this type of feedback. So yeah, doing climate surveys, a needs assessment, sort of seeing where are there issues, you know, how psychologically safe do your employees feel, which groups are feeling more or less psychologically safe and why. Um, you know, what are the reasons or different sources of tension, and you know who or what is contributing to that lack of psychological safety. I think, you know, just as a starting point, asking these questions and fostering additional lines of communication with your employees and actually listening to your employees, all of these things are really critical to fostering that sense of psychological safety. So I think if you're an organizational leader and you're asking these questions, then I think you're on the right track.
I'm curious, you mentioned assessments, keep them anonymous, and then being able to slice by group who's feeling unsafe.
Oh,
Um, Yeah, this is really challenging. And I'm thinking
mhm.
specifically in number one, small organizations
Yep.
and organizations where you have a lot of only. So maybe the only person from a ethnic group, the only visibly disabled person, that kind of thing. How do you learn that information if by reporting that they don't feel safe, they feel like they're putting their job in there for their livelihood?
It's a great question, and definitely a struggle that we have in this area. I remember I ran a climate survey on my former psychology department, and there were 50 employees, and we asked a host of different demographic questions. And I remember full professors didn't feel comfortable even reporting their demographics in the survey, or being fully honest and transparent, even though it was anonymous. So it's definitely an issue. I think one thing that I try to do is to really emphasize ahead of time how we plan to use the data, what analyses we are going to do, and who is going to see that data, that individual level data. I always say that we're going to at least only report data for groups for which there are at least three or more individuals, so that you can't exactly identify, you know, oh, the Latinx employees experienced X, Y, and Z. And if there's only, one or two people who identify that way, then that would be problematic, right? And then I think just over time, you can build and develop this trust with those individuals, after the first time doing this, and how we reported and handled the data and what we did in responding to that data, and trying to make positive changes. Then I think over time, more and more people started to feel comfortable sharing and being open within those surveys. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge, specifically within smaller organizations. And as we're trying to look at the experiences of people with highly minoritized identities or intersectionally stigmatized identities, which is super important, but it can be somewhat difficult. For smaller groups, also, it sometimes makes more sense to maybe uh, focus on, um, instead of just the anonymous feedback route, which I think is always important to always have that option, maybe focus groups or individual interviews. Sometimes within that setting, those people might feel more comfortable sharing, even though it's not anonymous. Um, it can provide a more psychologically safe environment for those people to share. So, yeah, great question.
Natasha, what recommendations do you have for clients in assessing really what the temperature is within their organization?
Ooh. Mm, my recommendation at first is to be brave in what you think you know, what you don't know, and how you're going to address it. Because what you may find may not be a reflection of what you're being told by those that you have left in, that you have trusted to run particular departments that have now highlighted issues. So my recommendation would be understand for you as a leader, what is it that you want to achieve and why? Because if you're only going to do it at surface level, then the people that you're supposed to transform and watch them grow in your organization, become new leaders, that won't happen. For diverse employees, and especially here in the UK, in the PR and the communications sector, we had a recent report come out this year by the Chartered Institute of Public Relations and a group called UK Black Comms Network that reported 44% of mid to senior talent are looking to leave the profession. And that is because what we have found when it comes to psychological safety, surface level sentiment around really digging deep to address what the situations are. And more importantly, Emily, what we have found is holding people accountable to have them ensure that this behavior or this bias or whatever these issues are cannot be accepted and tolerated in this organization. Because in showing one group that it's okay to do this and another group it's not, then how am I as a leader meant to go out there and speak about D&I, CSR, ESG, when I as a leader know that I'm not doing what needs to be done to ensure that my team understand that in the leadership that I display, it should be a reflection of the leadership that is then echoed down within the organization. So I would say to leaders is be honest with yourself. What is it that you want to achieve? Because where we are in the state of the nation, your transparency is something that can be seen if it's not if it's not honest. We can call it out. We can see what it is. We've seen it in different elements of the world in the media with George Floyd. We've seen what happens when you're not really honest about what should happen because you don't want to create the accountable change that needs to happen. So I think leaders need to be honest with themselves, because I guess it comes back down to the different dynamics of how a leader should be composed: authoritative, consultative, do you know what I mean, challenging, and situational. It's, you need to understand what do you want to gain, and in understanding what you want to gain and how it not only reflects on yourself as a leader but your organization, it's then the second point would be, what is going to be the plan to get that done? And that, I would recommend, should be done with external support. So this is where this leader should reach out to external mentors, external advisors, that once data is received, pending on the decision he wishes to make, decisions that need to be made, which some may be difficult, some may be quite easy to fix, not having a biased insight on the leaders that you've seen grow, you work with, to be able to have the opportunity to influence a decision to work in their favor, is why I agree that in this second point, ensuring as a leader that you know that if I'm going to do this, I'm going to need external support because of what I could face, is the second thing. And I would say the third thing is results. Now, I'm not talking about results that are going to impact the bottom line and showcase, how great we are as an organization. I'm talking about the results that employees are going to see on the ground. That they don't have to all be loud, not all will be announced, but in you delivering results where they can see that in a conversation I've had and across many touch points, even though it may take weeks, months, there has been what has been put in place is sustainable and transformative change. I think those types of results speak a lot louder to diverse employees than just talking, because we're all very good at that. But if we don't put it to action, what does that even mean? And so for me, those would be my three things I speak to leaders about, and kind of position these are the things that you should be thinking about.
I'd like to hear from our audience too, folks, if you have a method of measuring psychological safety in the workplace, if you, like Natasha said, if you come at that with a plan ahead of time, as in, we're going to measure this and this is how we might go about addressing things. So if anyone wants to put that in the chat, I would be curious to know. Isaac, I'm interested in a certain sort of bit of research that you do, which is the invisible and visible parts of our identities. I think this is really interesting because some of the intersections of who we are and the things that describe who we are aren't always visible. So, visible things like race and sometimes gender is visible. Other times things are not. Sexual orientation, religion, sometimes disability is not visible either. How do these different components of who we are affect our sense of belonging at work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. I think all identities have certain aspects of being more visible or less visible depending on the situation. I think each of these different identities, I do research on all the different barriers, unique barriers faced by each of these different groups. Um, and yeah, we know that each of these groups are more likely to feel psychologically unsafe at work because they're more likely to be targeted for discrimination or interpersonal uh, incivility and ostracism from their coworkers and their supervisors as well. Um, and there are differences in how these different groups um, experience the workplace environment, especially if it's a quote unquote fully invisible identity. Um, you know, a lot of my work initially focused on concealable identities, but what I'm realizing now is that a lot of these ideas and theories about the negative effects of suppressing or concealing a part of yourself also relate to more visible identities like gender and race as well. I think in general, if you feel like you are having to suppress or downplay a part of your identity, it's going to have these negative psychological effects. You're not able to bring your full authentic self into the workplace. You don't feel like your entire self belongs or that all of you is valued or appreciated within the organization. And I think that has, again, detrimental effects on any person of any identity. And yeah, we just know from the literature there's a host of negative outcomes here associated with that. Initially, there were, early on, there was this idea that, why are we talking about identity, especially these invisible identities within the workplace environment? Oh, you're gay or Muslim, you don't, that's invisible. So why does that matter? Just don't talk about that at work. And even for all identities, there was sort of this idea that we just didn't need to bring this up in a professional workplace context. But then what we are finding is that, you know, this idea that you can't talk about who you are outside of work and you have to sort of whitewash your identity and sort of uh, mold yourself to the majority identity had very detrimental effects on people psychologically, and that it let consistently we found in meta-analyses and reviews that the psychological intrapersonal negative effects of concealment are very real and very strong, again, across all identities. But then there was sort of this idea that, oh, you have to balance that with the trade-off of the negative interpersonal effects of bringing yourself and disclosing who you are at work. And so this idea that there's psychological benefits to disclosing and being your full authentic self, but that's always met with interpersonal negative effects. What my research specifically focuses on is actually how, in many situations, disclosing and expressing who you are fully actually also can lead to interpersonal benefits as well, that people actually value and appreciate that authenticity. They appreciate you being vulnerable with them and sharing who you fully, your full true self. When you're trying to stifle that, it can, lead to people in many situations not viewing you as less likable, less authentic, and less they can tell that you're trying to hide something from them. And so I just think that's something that's really interesting. Of course, there's a lot of boundary conditions to this, but I think that that's just one thing I like to emphasize in my research is that it's important for these people to feel like they can for all people to be able to bring their full selves into the workplace, and that doing so can really lead to a host of different benefits for the individual as well as for the team and the organization.
Yeah, what you said at the beginning of that statement regarding, oh, if some of these things are, so-called invisible, why bring them up? But it just feels odd if it's Monday morning and you're chatting with your colleagues about what you did over the weekend. Realistically, those things might be part of the conversation. You might have done something with your faith community. You might have done something with your same-sex partner. Why would it would be okay for me to talk about my heterosexual relationship and my husband, but my coworker not be able to talk about their same-sex relationship? It almost feels mythical. Like, what do you mean you can't talk about these things? What do you mean you can't disclose them?
Mhm.
The
So
the
yeah,
party
exactly. And
groups do. Yeah.
yeah, and in these, psychologically unsafe environments, those people might feel like they have to either lie about who they are and what they did that weekend and create this false narrative. And of course, that has psychologically detrimental effects. And people can sometimes tell over time that somebody's not being fully authentic, or they might just try to shut down and avoid and they keep their walls up and they try to either avoid those conversations or skirt the issue. And again, that has essentially the same effect. So um, again, it's very much a difficult identity management dilemma that these employees have to figure out how to navigate in the workplace. But again, there are very real um, pros and cons here.
I like to keep talking about those relationships and belonging with our coworkers. How do you recommend team members help foster a psychologically safe environment? What's the role of something like allyship? And what about environments where maybe you have great team members, but the manager is part of the problem? Maybe they're really lousy. Isaac, we'll start with you, and Natasha, I'd like to hear from you as well.
Sure. So let's see. Within my research on allyship, um, I often break this down into sort of more uh, support behaviors and advocacy behaviors. So there's, a lot that allies and team members can do to sort of support individuals and support marginalized individuals within the team. Um, Within these support behaviors, I'm talking about more one-on-one uh, behaviors that are actually supporting the individual in a more private way, whereas advocacy behaviors are behaviors that are trying to change the environment around them and improve things in a general sense. So within support behaviors, I typically look at things like trying to proactively understand the individuals within a team and their experiences. Again, listening to and learning from those individuals, and fostering communication is vital. So yeah, just being willing and open to learn from people's experiences. And in addition to that, also not just relying on them, but also educating oneself about these different identities and experiences, and doing that work as well is also important, is what we find in the literature. You know, just celebrating people's differences and valuing their different experiences can be really powerful. Within advocacy, one of the big strategies that we study in the literature is confronting behavior. So obviously, um, confronting any instances of incivility, discrimination, or mistreatment that you see. And importantly, doing so even when the targeted person or group of people are not present or are not known to be present. You know, that type of allyship, and doing that in the correct way can be very effective as well. And then within advocacy, we also look at things like calling for improved organizational policies and practices. This is where sort of, you know, upwardly managing the, or calling out the manager as well can be important. I know it's difficult when there's this sort of power dynamic, and sort of navigating that can be an extra layer of difficulty here. But again, taking on some of that cost as an ally, that sort of social capital, and being willing to use that to support those around you is really important. You know, using your voice, not just on behalf of yourself, but on behalf of the team or the group, um, can be very powerful as well. Um, and yeah, definitely it's difficult to do this when it's coming from a manager. I think that's why, you know, having a solid sense of reporting mechanisms and who to go to during what situations, and how to go about resolving things can be important. So if it's your manager, then who do you go to complain about your manager, and how can you do that? And how can you communicate that in a way that's actually going to change things for the better? And importantly, within all of this, I want to emphasize that there's this term, called consensual allyship. My friend, colleague Thomas Sasso really studies this, and it's looking at, you know, making sure that when you're advocating and supporting your coworkers and your stigmatized peers, that you're doing so in a way that they actually appreciate and that, you know, they want from you. So checking in with them and making sure that you're supporting them in the ways that they want you to support them is important, especially when you're dealing with interpersonal dynamics between the manager, and subordinate. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of literature within allyship and ally strategies that I think relates broadly to supporting all coworkers who feel psychologically unsafe.
Natasha, what's your point of view on building teams that do this for each other? How do you foster psychological safety across, rank and file levels?
I think the main thing is, what do we all agree are some of the key things that, outside of what makes us different, we are all aligned to or believe should support the benefit and the success the team is going to generate. Because what you can find is, if you're able to find a level playing field where everybody doesn't always feel that we've got to focus on more on one group than another to ensure that the team works, while that is also very important, is a very important component. But if we all agree, for example, so I'll give you a very good example here in the UK. Within the PR and communications profession, there is a drinking culture. So it's always this thing of, to when you first come into a new team, when you're kind of being onboarded, you go out for dinner, and there's let's go out for drinks. If you win a new client, let's go out for drinks after work. It's Friday, let's go out for drinks after work. However, if we are now in a time and place, especially with Gen Z in the workplace, and they're a different breed that's causing a lot of wind, causing a lot of wind over here. But what you find is for Gen Z, their thing is we don't really kind of want to do that. And we don't think it should be something that if we don't do it, we are not considered as we don't want to engage with the team, we don't want to build and grow the team rapport. So I think for me, finding new ways to build teams that ensure that outside of the areas that we know we need to address for particular groups, let's also strengthen our understanding, awareness, and what we want for the team by also building alliances on areas and causes that are important to us and that will support us as a team, individually, collectively, which then ultimately supports the profitability that that team delivers for the business.
I want to talk about some practical things that employers can do. Natasha, what are good faith mistakes that you see employers make when they're trying to make a psychologically safe workplace? And maybe, well, maybe a little bit of insincerity too, but when they're trying in earnest to do this, where do you find that they fail naturally?
You're doing too much. Don't be over nice. Because when you come out of your own comfort zone, you come out of who you are, you can't maintain it. So I think it's important for leaders to understand, managers to recognize that if you, for example, are genuinely sorry, could you just repeat the question again? Because my mind's just gone and I want to bring it back so I don't veer off left again.
Yeah, no problem. Good faith mistakes that employers
Yeah.
try when they're really trying in earnest to make a psychologically safe workplace.
Yeah. I think the balance is all about doing what you want to do. So that I think that kind of brings my point back in, as in, let's be honest with what we know we can do and don't try to overcompensate or be something you're not. Because what we see a lot here at the foundation is it's like rose tinted glasses. And you may come in, and for example, you could come in, a manager, let's do lunch. They start off really consistent. And with consistency comes trust. But when things begin to shift, automatically it can create doubt in an employee's mind because psychologically they may be thinking, has something changed? Why the consistency of what has been built has been changed, which is why it's really important for managers to know their capacity and don't try to overcompensate, especially if for the minority groups that you may be managing, and you know that there isn't much here, while, and I can't speak for all people of color here in the UK, while we appreciate that we know there are issues, we just need you to ensure that in doing your job, because you understand the importance of what that means. If that means it's all you can do, just do that. But for us, I would say one of the key things is just find your balance, find your truth, because the respect that you receive from owning that truth and delivering in that truth can have really good impact for employees who at least know where they stand with that manager. So I think keep keep it real. Keep it real to yourself first so that you can keep it real to everybody that you're managing, because you also have to remember you're a role model. So they're also looking at you as a leader. And if you are not authentic to your own leadership and development skills, part of your role is to inspire, coach, and develop them. So if you're not going to be honest with yourself, then how, even if it is in good faith, how do you expect us to grow and develop with you and under you if that realism isn't there yet? And I think that would be my main point. There's probably loads of others as well, but I think for what we've seen, especially over the last 9 months here in the UK, I think that's one of the main prominent ones, which is impacting the data that I shared earlier about a lot of our mid to senior talent looking to leave the industry.
What's the significance of the last 9 months in the UK?
The the ability to not keep it real. Because as I said to the response before, when you are not genuine about, you know, the trust that you need to build, and going back to the inconsistency, what it begins to look like is if it was only being done to maintain an image for the business, it then has an ongoing impact, which then sees employees realize that this isn't real, which means even if I build trust with you and share information about myself, this inconsistency in your ability to lead me as my manager also means that, am I able to trust you with the other areas that we're building a relationship with, personally and professionally, for the business? Which in the first 6 months, you don't know. You're taking people as they are. You take your manager as they are. But as you go into a year, 2 years, 3 years, and then you add in situations of, okay, recruitment, I mean, promotion cycles are coming up. You know, you may have had a conversation with your manager the year before, you know, we're going to work on this, we're going to do this with you to get you ready for promotion next year. Yet, over that next year, your manager doesn't deliver in what they have said they're going to help you work on to get to that promotion. So then the promotion cycle comes round, and you go back to your manager who you believed, when they were sharing what they were sharing with you, that they were going to do their part as your manager to deliver, because they understand the importance of what that means for them as leaders in and sustaining that retention, as well as what it means for the business. Now it's all broken. And for this year, on top of the race riots that we had out here in the UK, it was a really pivotal moment where, for a lot of people of color in mid and senior positions, for a lot of them, they were just like, Natasha, it's enough. I've got to go, because I've been here 3 years, 5 years. Nothing's changing. Nothing's happening. It's the same thing. So I hope that gives you a bit of clarity to that, because yeah, I think it comes back to that transparency piece. If you can be honest with yourself as a leader in what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, where do I need to go to my manager and get support so that I can be the best leader for my team. If we're not ready to do that, then we're going to continue here in the UK to see the lack of diverse employees in a profession that we need diverse representation, because we are communicating the society to the society.
Isaac, what would you add? Good faith mistakes that employers make when they're trying to do this.
So I think, one thing that Natasha keeps highlighting is this idea that I guess I first want to talk about not so good faith mistakes, in that managers
Sure.
often just want a magic bullet to fix things. They say, oh, there's this problem with psychological safety. What can I do to just like put a band-aid on this and keep moving? So what are their motivations? Do they truly actually care about changing things? And sometimes they don't, right? They just want a quick fix, but there's not a quick fix to this. There's not just a 30-minute training you can give, or some, organizational statement you can put out that then changes the climate of the organization. And so, a lot of times I think an issue that we see is organizations that are very performative about this. And I think that comes from not having true, genuine motivations to positively support the employees. They're going to jump on the bandwagon and post something when they feel like it's popular to do so. And then as soon as it's no longer popular, they get rid of their DEI program. Um, and they just respond reactively when they need to instead of proactively. So I think that's one issue that um, I would say is a not so good faith mistake. On the other hand, in terms of thinking of this question of good faith mistakes is really interesting to me. I would say generally it's when leaders act before listening. So um, they think there's an issue and they want to improve things. And even if it's coming from a genuine place, they just start doing things before listening to their employees and what those employees need. I think of this in terms of, again, non-consensual allyship or the misguided allies who sort of act on behalf of the group or do things that they think are supporting a certain group of people, but that are super misguided and that the people don't appreciate and actually makes things worse, right? So I think if you're not first taking the time to really listen to and communicate with your employees and see what are the problems, what do they need, again, going back to our discussion on different ways of doing that, I think that's a really important pivotal first step before you start enacting policies and doing things to make these positive changes. Because if not, I think that's where we get a lot of those missteps that can sometimes make the climate worse rather than better.
I worked in an organization years ago in which I had a colleague who I think in earnest was trying to do the right thing. She corrected someone's language about neurodivergent employees. She acknowledged herself she did not belong to that group. I'll be honest, she gave us a lecture on how we were doing it wrong, but she didn't know who was in that room. And like everybody else did, like we knew that there was a neurodivergent employee and and it was painful. It was really, really painful. And I don't know if that person ever had a conversation with her later about this. But I could just see on their face, it was like, I don't know, this makes me really uncomfortable. That was a really bad conversation to be in. It was really tough. And I just sat there
Yeah.
quietly. I felt like I couldn't add anything worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, that does sound very painful. I think oftentimes allies try to speak on behalf of a group or like,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
know, uh, can do, awful things like that without knowing. And I think also related to that, you mentioned giving a lecture. If you actually care about making a positive change, you know, um, just sort of lashing out at people who make a mistake isn't going to lead to positive long-term results here. I think I'm a big advocate for calling in versus calling out, and trying to recognize that people make mistakes and supporting people in their ally development instead of attacking people who are trying when they make a mistake. Because that can push them in the opposite direction. So if you're really doing this because you want to make a positive change in the organization rather than make yourself look good for knowing the most about you know these different
Whatever
identities and
terms to be
whatever
used. Yeah.
term is in the correct terminology and stuff like that. I think that is again really important. What are your motivations? Are they truly to benefit others, or are they to benefit yourself? I think is what it comes down to.
Natasha, a bit ago you brought up consistency and the need to be consistent in order to build trust. Any other advice on maintaining psychological safety over the long term? There's going to be turnover in an organization, just naturally, not even necessarily bad, but when you have change of leadership, when you have allies who leave because they move or they find a new job. How do you maintain that consistently?
You have to recognize what information your team needs, why, the purpose, the benefit, the critique. And if the critique is going to be good for the business, then let's keep that in as well. Because psychological safety within the workplace, and especially in dynamics where the makeup may be different in terms of the different demographics that you have in the organization, is very important to also be aware of who you're speaking to, the different groups. You've got the Gen Z, millennials, alongside all the different intersections across race, faith, and everything else we've spoken about today. So I would say that one of my other piece of advice would be, in terms of maintaining it, is understanding what transparency in terms of information needs to be shared, so that for the benefit of your team, who they are, what their remit is, how it contributes to who they connect and work with internally and externally. It gives them a positive environment that will always have a few bumps here and there, but it will give them a positive environment to be able to ensure that whatever we need from them, there is a channel that they can articulate a response, whether it be via people, whether it be via email, etc. So I would say it's maintaining that level of transparency, even when it may be a bit challenging, because psychological safety is also about, oh, having an awareness, so that, again, if there is anything that is shared that I can either support or be a part of, I can deliver because I've been made aware. And in knowing that I'm being considered, it strengthens the relationships that we have, and it maintains that trust. It maintains the ability to grow as a team. Because I think for me, my last thing is understanding what psychological safety means to your team, because it may not mean the same thing to everybody, because everybody may look at psychological safety a bit differently, especially if they are from a different demographic, if they've worked in the organization a bit longer than others, or there's so many different ways to also ensure, how do I maintain that as a leader delivering to the team, and how do I ensure, in understanding how everybody views it, I can find a way to bring consensus. I think that's important. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. To close this out, Isaac, what do we still not know about establishing and preserving psychological safety? What questions are we still having to ask and explore? What do you find in your research?
I mean, this is a relatively new term. It really caught traction in the 90s. And there's still so much that we don't know. Um, and, I think looking at especially long term, how do we make positive changes to psychological safety, and sort of like the experimental studies showing cause and effect here. We have fewer of those, but I think specifically what we need more research on is, again, what are the ways that we can improve psychological safety, and for whom and under what conditions are different interventions most needed. So um, we don't have enough research looking at how different groups differently respond to these cues. Um, we just did a study on the identity safety cues among trans and gender expansive people of color. And, it was interesting to see that the cues that matter most to this group aren't always aligned with the cues of what matters within the broader literature. And that's because most of the literature focuses on, more white upper class male samples. And so I think just, again, looking at identity intersecting with this and the demographic differences, and how to foster psychologically safe environment is where I would like to see this research go. Again, there's just so much left to explore, and I I I think that yeah, just all the different moderators, boundary conditions, outcomes of psychological safety, um, we're still learning about. So yeah,
And I hope you'll be a part of studying that and
I'm
exploring that with.
working on it.
Thank you both so much. This has been such a perfect combination of theory and research and application. This has been wonderful. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today as well. This webinar, of course, was brought to you by Attunes, the AI-driven platform that measures intrinsic motivation and psychological safety. If you'd like to learn more about how Attuned can enhance communication within your organization, you can visit attuned.ai. Thanks again to all of our panelists and our audience. Everyone stay well.
Thank you.